One presidential candidate drawing significant support as an independent outside the two-party system, drawing significant support in recent polls, but nevertheless excluded from last night's CNN debate. That man is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was told that he did not qualify for CNN's debate despite receiving as much as 10% or more support in several recent polls. Now, RFK Jr. participated in his own programming during the debate, where he answered many of the same questions as Presidents Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And he joins Rising now. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, Robbie.
It's our pleasure. Thank you so much for making time. First, give us your impression of what happened last night. So many in America are concerned about what they heard from perhaps both Trump and Biden, but in particularly President Biden. A lot of the concerns related to his age and mental fitness on display last night. Even, very hardcore Democratic staffers deeply concerned, talks of swapping him out. What were your impressions from the debate?
Yeah, I wasn't that surprised by his performance because, we've seen that kind of frailty from him before, but I think it was a bad look for America, the whole debate where the world's exemplary democracy, we're supposed to be modeling the benefits of democracy to the globe. And we have 341 million people in this country, and I think a lot of the world is probably asking, is that it? Is that really the best that you can do? But I think that it was a particularly bad night for President Biden.
One of the hottest topics last night was the economy. A lot of Americans are really feeling inflation, struggling to pay rent and their most basic bills. And we've had a term from either of these candidates, and it seems that the working class of America is unsatisfied with both of their performance while in office and are ready for something different. Can you speak to how your position on the economy is different from what we heard last night?
Well, the force that's driving inflation, which I think everybody understands in this country, is this ballooning deficit. We now have a deficit that's $34 trillion. The cost of servicing that debt is larger than our military budget. And within 5 years, the cost of servicing that debt is going to absorb 50 cents out of every dollar we raise in taxes. Within 10 years, 100% of every dollar that we raise in taxes is going to go to servicing the debt. It's unsustainable, but President Biden and President Trump will not address that because they contributed disproportionately to it. Almost half the debt was run up by these two presidents. In fact, President Trump came into office promising that he was going to balance the budget, and he ran up an $8 trillion debt. He spent more money than every president in the United States history combined, from George Washington to George W. Bush, 283 years of U.S. history. And then President Biden is now on track to beat him. We're adding $1 trillion to the deficit every 90 days. And it's being driven by the war machine, which neither of them can unravel. It's being driven by chronic disease, which they presided over, this explosion of chronic disease, which is now absorbing 5 times our military budget, $4.3 trillion a year. That's our biggest cost. And neither of them has the capacity to do it. And then, we could eliminate tremendous amounts of waste in government using AI, using blockchain, but you never hear either of these candidates talking about those things. They're about to change all of our lives. They offer tremendous potential for our country. They're the path out of the debt. We need a new industry because we can't cut our way out of this debt. We have to grow our way out of it. We have to grow GDP. And that new industry has the best potential as AI and also blockchain. But we're driving those out of the country, and neither of these candidates ever talk about either the peril or the potential of those new technologies.
You said in an interview last night on News Nation that you would be open to replacing Joe Biden on the Democratic ticket. Has any high-level Democratic official reached out to you since you expressed that openness? And do you expect them to, given how hard they've gone against allowing you to participate in their primary and excluding you from the debate stage?
No, I'm not holding my breath. We're running our campaign. We're going to be on every ballot by the beginning of next month. And, I think that the Democratic Party now, the superdelegates particularly, are controlled by the big corporate donors. And I think that those corporate donors would probably prefer to have Donald Trump as president than to have me as president. I think for the same reason that they didn't like Bernie Sanders. And I think I'm 10 times greater threat to the status quo than Bernie Sanders was.
And we should mention that you obviously were not in the debate last night. CNN said the criteria was going to be 15% support in 4 recent polls, kind of mimicking the debate commission's criteria, even though the debate commission has been thrown out, and Trump and Biden both said we're not doing that. And it seemed like actually they could make whatever arrangement with CNN they wanted. And you did have that level of support in at least 3 polls. It was as close as it can be. You've pointed out that if the criteria is you have to actually be qualified in enough states to get to 270 electoral votes, well, Biden and Trump aren't the official nominees of their parties yet. So how do they count? What do you make of the excuses to keep you out of that debate at a time where millions of Americans are expressing profound dissatisfactions with the 2 choices put before them?
Yeah, and it was arbitrary because CNN, we actually submitted 5 polls to CNN that qualified of me at 15% or over, including CNN's own poll from April. We submitted the Harvard-Harris poll, and CNN told us we're not going to count that company because we never do. We sent them a reel of their announcers talking about Harvard-Harris polls. So that was disingenuous. But on their list of the 12 qualifying polling firms was Monmouth, and we qualified on the Monmouth poll, and they arbitrarily threw that out. So they did not want me on this stage. I think it's bad for our country. I think, listen, President Biden was ridiculing Vladimir Putin because he won by 88% of the vote in Russia. And he said that Vladimir Putin won because he could control the media in Russia and because he wasn't letting his political opponents on the ballot. And that's the same thing that's happening here in this country. The Democratic Party is apparently going to sue me in every state. This is what we now have just learned. And they control the media. I mean, this is the first time in American history since my uncle cut the first televised debate in 1960. Since then, the debates have always been run by a neutral organization, but by the League of Women's Voters for the first 25 years, and for the last 25 years, by the Presidential Debates Commission. Either of those organizations, I would have gone on the stage, but they didn't want me on the stage, so they cut an independent deal with CNN. CNN made tens of millions of dollars from that debate, so of course they're in. Plus, both the campaigns are almost certainly going to feed tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars more in advertising to CNN. So the whole thing is this, corrupt merger of state and corporate power that I entered this race in protest of and fighting against. And it's kind of the worst example of you've got a media company that's owned by BlackRock, the biggest owners of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And they're some of the biggest donors to both the Democratic and Republican political party. They own all the military contractors, which are profiteering on the Ukraine war. BlackRock has the contract to rebuild what it destroyed with the government. And they own Pfizer and all the pharmaceutical companies that are paying for the advertising. So I think Americans look at this web of conflicts and see that, what's come out of it, which is the Biden and Trump duopoly. And they're saying, okay, this system is just rigged, and it's rigged to service these big corporations, these big billionaires. And that, that's the reason that 70% of the people in this country are making less than the cost of basic human needs. That's the reason that over the past 10 years, 1% of the top 1% of the population now controls more wealth, owns more wealth than the 60% of the middle class, what's left of the middle class, which is almost nothing. Americans are struggling today, and they're struggling because this duopoly is systematically stripping the middle class of its wealth and its equity and destroying the American dream.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's one of the things my mind immediately goes to when I consider 2024 and who to vote for. It's interesting to hear you say you're 10 times of a threat to the status quo. Compared to Bernie Sanders, I would say Bernie Sanders threatened the status quo precisely because of his positions on corporate power. I appreciate you sharing more of your positions on that. You alluded to pharmaceutical companies, which in the past you've called Big Pharma in the U.S. a criminal enterprise. We saw yesterday the Supreme Court turn over that sweetheart deal from 2007 under the W. Bush administration, when his DOJ said they had enough to criminally prosecute executives at Purdue Pharma who knowingly sold and pushed OxyContin, knowing that it would end up being addictive and becoming a street drug. And George W. Bush said, no, we're not going to do that. And the Sackler family, who owned Purdue Pharma for quite some time, agreed to pay just $6 billion, and there would be no further prosecution. Now we're in a position where a new administration could potentially criminally prosecute those executives at Purdue Pharma and have some repercussion for the opioid crisis that's caused over 200,000 deaths in the past 2 decades. What can we expect to see from an RFK Jr. presidency in cracking down on corporate power and the merging of corporations in the state in the U.S.?
Yeah, you're going to see a real crackdown. And those, the 4 principal pharmaceutical companies have paid $79 billion in criminal penalties and settlements over the past 15 years. So when I say it's a criminal enterprise, I'm not using that term hyperbolically. This is what they do, and as long as the penalties are, a mere $6 billion, those are rounding errors for the company. These are the biggest companies in the world now. This is the biggest industry in the world, and they look at that as the cost of doing business. I mean, I'll give you an example. Merck, around 2007, it released the Vioxx, and Vioxx ended up killing between 120,000 and 500,000 Americans of heart attacks. Merck knew that drug caused heart attacks and marketed it as a pain reliever, as a headache medicine, as an arthritis medicine, but it didn't tell its customers that it also could kill you. And I think a lot of those customers, if they'd had informed choice, would have said, oh, I could get a heart attack from this. I'm going to take an aspirin instead. And they weren't given that choice. And Vioxx knew it was going to kill them. We actually, during the litigation, we got spreadsheets from their bean counters that showed how many people they were going to kill, what the settlements would be, and then announced in a delighted way, we're still going to make a killing on this. So they made a double killing, and they knew they were going to do it. It was planned, it was premeditated, and it's premeditated murder. So somebody should have gone to jail, and until we start sending them to jail, they're not going to change their behavior. This is the way you make money in the pharmaceutical industry, and as you pointed out, we're now killing from opioids, overdoses mainly. 107,000 kids last year died in this country. And, I lost a friend on Friday to fentanyl overdose. I lost one of my nieces during the COVID pandemic to an overdose as well. And we're seeing that, every family in this country is now touched by this. We're killing more kids each year, double the number that we killed in the 20-year Vietnam War, but every year, year after year. And these companies, it's now a lot of illegal imported drugs, but this addiction crisis started with Sackler Pharma and the Purdue family. And, there's now 2 wonderful documentaries that my wife and I have watched on Netflix where anybody can go and see exactly what they did. And it was, it was premeditated murder of hundreds of thousands of people, and they shouldn't get away with it.
In a similar vein, during your closing remarks last night at your debate on X, you talked about the lack of pride that young people have in this country. And we've also seen that the youth mental health crisis has been incredibly exacerbated over the past 5 to 10 years. And yet our country prescribes more SSRIs and anti-anxiety medications than ever. How would an RFK Jr. presidency approach the youth mental health crisis without relying on big pharma to just prescribe more drugs?
Yeah, I mean, my Peace Corps program or Moonshot program is going to be a series of wellness farms where kids can go, where there'll be no screens, no social media, no computers, where kids can go and learn the trades. The trades are the one jobs that are going to be immune from AI for the longest. Oh, people are always going to need a plumber to walk up your stairs for many years until they have robots doing it. If you need to fix your toilet or if you have an electric outage, somebody's got to crawl into your crawl space. AI is going to eliminate a lot of crap, but we're not teaching the trades anymore. And the federal government is not providing money. They'll pay for you to go to college, give you loans to go to college, but not to a 2-year or 3-year trade school. And we need to change that. But I'm going to have these farms where people will grow organic food so that we can have, part of the problem with the mental health crisis is we're mass poisoning this whole generation of kids. We have 1,000 ingredients in processed foods in this country that are illegal in Europe. We're destroying the soils. We're destroying the environment. We're destroying the health of our kids. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% do. And the cost has risen from about 6% of our GDP to almost 19%. And it's destroying our country in so many ways. But most of all, it's destroying the morale, the mental health of our kids. And part of that is social media. It's so difficult to be a kid today. And I have 7 children, and I see the pressures they're under. And they're feeling dispossessed, they're feeling alienated, they're feeling disconnected from community, from society, they're atomized, they're fragmented. And we have to go out as a nation and reclaim these children. We have to connect them to community again, to connect them to purpose, connect them to pride and hope. And that's what I'm going to do with these healing farms. I talked about it last night. I'm going to legalize marijuana federally. It's now legal in the state. I'm going to move it off Schedule I because even though most states now legalize marijuana, the federal government cannot collect taxes on them because it's Schedule I federally. I'm going to change that so the feds can start collecting taxes. That'll raise $8.5 billion. I'm going to use that money to start healing farms in rural communities all over this country. The biggest industry today in rural America is prisons, and I'm going to change that. I'm going to make it so we're going to have these healing farms. A lot of the people who are in prisons are nonviolent drug crimes. I'm going to move out into these camps, and you can stay there for free until you're healed, till you're ready to leave, and you're going to leave with a trade and a job. And you're right. The addiction, we have an illegal drug addiction in this country. We also have an addiction to these psychiatric drugs that are very, very little understood and may not be very effective. 120 million SRI prescriptions last year, 120 million benzo prescriptions. And then, of course, there's 120 million Adderall prescriptions because our kids all have ADHD now. And nobody's asking why, but we need to change that. We need to end the chronic disease epidemic by ending the exposures that are causing it. And we need to start treating and healing and reclaiming this lost generation of American kids. And we need to then get them into houses because if they don't have houses, we don't have a middle class in this country. And the greatest economic engine in America in world history, the American middle class, is being decimated because they do not have equity. And if they, no matter what kind of entrepreneurial impulse you have, if you don't have equity, you can't pursue it. That we need to get them into homes.
What is your pitch this morning to both Biden voters and Trump voters, to the person who supported Biden but watched what they saw last night and can't imagine voting to give that person 4 more years in office? What's your pitch to that person? And then what is your pitch to the Trump voter to win them over to the RFK Jr. camp?
Look, I'm already beating President Trump and President Biden among young people. I'm also beating them among independent voters, which is the largest voting demographic for the first time in American history this election year. Self-identified independents are about 43% of American voters versus 27% Democrat, 27% Republican. I have the greatest favorability rating of Trump and President Trump and President Biden. That means people would prefer to vote for me, but they're not going to vote for me, many of those Trump and Biden supporters, because they're scared that the other guy will then win. So they're voting out of fear. And, what I need to do over the next 4 months, Robbie, is to convince Americans that they can take a risk and vote out of hope, vote out of inspiration, vote out of faith in their future and pride in their country, rather than vote out of fear. FDR made this, this tremendous urging to Americans that with the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and that was very wise. And if we succumb to fear, we're going to get more of the same. You know what's going to happen if President Biden or President Trump gets reelected? We're going to have more of the same. We're going to have more division, more vitriol, more anger, more debt, more wars, more chronic disease, and the continued diminution of hope in our country. And I'm offering something different. If I get elected, everything's going to change. Everything's going to change. And if people want that, if people want their America back, they should vote for me.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you so much for joining Rising today. We do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. That was a good one.
Yeah.